Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. Today we are meeting with Sue Jamieson. Sue is a forensic psychologist and clinical lead for the TC Plus HMP Gartree. TC Plus, which we'll talk about in detail later, is a specialist therapeutic community in a prison for men with learning difficulties. Sue's done a number of very interesting things before joining the TC, and we're always interested in how and why people take a particular path in life. So welcome, Sue, and thanks for meeting with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Sue. Really pleased to meet you. And I was really interested when David said you had a number of jobs before you became a forensic psychologist. You've been a developmental scientist, a bone marrow scientist. You've also trained as a medical herbalist and a nutritionist, which got me thinking about the fact there's so much pressure to take up a career. People ask at 18, what do you want to do? But you've obviously had a number of different goes at it. Why did you end up having so many different careers?
I'm not really sure why. I know I left school at 18 with no idea really about what I wanted to do. And my parents sort of said, well, you should go to university and do this or that. And I said, well, I don't want to go to university. So I ended up getting a job. Actually, my first job was a lab technician. And what they did, they actually paid for me to do my degree in applied biology. So I worked up with them through to development scientists. So I worked on developing immunoassays for thyroid disorders, and because I was always interested in science and how things worked. So that was sort of how I got into the developmental scientist bit, which I did actually enjoy. But then due to personal circumstances, actually, I decided I wanted to take a year out travelling. So once I got my degree in applied biology, I thought, right, done that, tick that, and went off travelling to Australia. And there I started off looking around for jobs because I decided I wanted to work there. And the job that I actually managed to get was a bone marrow scientist. So it was almost purely by coincidence. But that was it was an interesting job. It was early pioneering actually with stem cells and bone marrow transplants in patients with leukemias, myelomas, and in fact, most of the stuff that I did was myeloma and hematological cancers. And then what happened was that can be a little bit anti-establishment, and I sort of felt that the drug companies tended to have a big say in patient treatment, and people weren't really treated quite as individuals. So it made me think, I need to look around at a different way of dealing with this. So I then chose medical herbalism because my family are all gardeners and my grandmother was into herbs. So it sort of seemed to be a bit, I guess, in my blood, really. So I then, alongside working as a bone marrow scientist, trained as a medical herbalist. And that was actually, it was quite tough. It took a while. I then got pregnant and had my daughter and decided I wanted to return to the UK. So having qualified as a medical herbalist, I returned to the UK and then I set up my own business as a medical herbalist, which I really enjoyed doing, but it was quite lonely, and it was also a little bit of a battle with the medical establishment because I did specialise, ironically enough, in cancer treatment, and there was always a battle between chemotherapy and herbal medicine and pharmacology and things. It's less so now, but it was a real battle in those days. But I guess one of the things that I really did notice was that actually what helped people alongside the herbs work very well with diet and the nutrition. But one of the really important bit was the person's sort of state of mind, really, and mindset. And also, when I actually spent time with a patient, I would spend at least an hour and a half with them, and I'd go through their whole life story right from birth. And what tended to come out was that people's traumas, past, all of that sort of thing had a huge impact on where they were health-wise in the present day. So that sort of led me to think, what's the mind got to do with all of this? I'm quite interested in how does psychology, how does the mind work? How does all of that help. So that was the sort of, I knew a lot about the mechanics of the body from my science and that, but I didn't really understand the workings of the mind. And so I thought, right, I'll go and do a psychology degree. And then when I was doing the psychology degree, my father was also a member of the IMB, the Internal Monitoring Board for Grendon Prison. And he invited me to an open day there. And I had no idea about prisons. I think I probably just, the Daily Mail, although, all prisoners are monsters and that sort of mindset really, because I'd not encountered anything along those lines. I had heard a few stories of awful abuse from working with my patients in the herbal business, but not, like I eventually heard at Grendon. But I think going to Grendon to the open day just really blew my mind. And I thought, this is really, really eye-opening. And I think that I realised that these people were just normal people or ordinary people, that terrible things had happened to them, in turn done terrible things to other people. And I decided, you know what, I would like to be part of this, but I don't really want to be a prison officer because that's not my thing. I think I'll be a forensic psychologist, which, well, was very hard to become a forensic psychologist. I think probably the hardest thing I've ever done. So that was sort of how I got there.
It's really interesting to hear about your journey. I suppose really interested to hear about you coming from a very biological background and getting increasingly interested in the mind. I suppose I've got more interested in biology over time, not in terms of medication necessarily, but things like Bruce Lipton's work on the biology of belief, for instance, and how, our mind's ability to influence our biology. I just think so fascinating, yes. Really. But one of the things I was really keen to ask you about, Sue, is, I think it is interesting that you pursued training as a forensic psychology later on as a more mature person, because I think psychology is one of those careers. People leave university at 21 with a psychology degree and they're desperate to be a qualified applied psychologist, whether that be clinical, forensic, occupational, educational. And I wondered what it was like to train as a more mature person in psychology.
To be fair, it was horribly frustrating. It was a really difficult route. And I think because I did all of my training at Grendon is a very different forensic environment to a normal prison. So I think a lot of the focus of the training is on risk assessments and it's quite structured. But Grendon was far more, therapy, and it was really quite difficult to fit the actual work that you do into these sort of narrow constrictions of what was required of you. And I did struggle. I really did struggle. I had never struggled with anything before. I got first class honours in my degrees. I got, did masters, and I'd always managed to do that. The route was so maybe broad or so unspecific and so confusing and so very difficult that I found it, and it was very hard to apply some of the stuff to actually what you do, because it's trying to pigeonhole and buttonhole and everything, which, you're dealing with really complicated individuals who are extremely complex, and it's quite difficult, I found. So I did struggle. It took me a long time to do it. It took me, I think I went from one route. I started on the BPS route and then I changed to the Cardiff route, which was actually slightly more structured and a little bit more easy to do. But yeah, it was a hard journey, the hardest actually, I'd say, of anything I'd done. And I think because with biological systems, they either are or they aren't. With science, it is or it isn't. But psychology is a whole different ball game.
I don't think you're the only person to struggle though. So we had a couple, when I was at Whitemore, we had a couple of trainees who took 9 years, and they were in their 20s when they started. And I remember starting as they were just, they'd already been doing it for a couple of years, I think. And I was thinking you could have gone and applied to be on a clinical psychology training course and qualified and probably be almost a consultant in the amount of time it's taken you to do this. But I wondered how your previous careers have shaped your attitude towards forensic psychology, because my experience of when people train late is they often bring a much broader way of thinking about what they encounter, and there's a richness to having had life experience before training as a psychologist.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that really struck me was the sort of terrible diets in prison and the lack of, light and the lack of just environmental stimulus. And so, yeah, I think that because I've been a herbalist and always tried to look at someone holistically, I think that made, in my work, I've always tried to do that. And so I think that was helpful in bringing some of that background. And certainly, I did try and implement vitamin D at Grendon. And I think Jamie Bennett was in agreement with it. But then it never went anywhere. And now I noticed since I've been at Gartree for a while during COVID, I think everybody got free vitamin D on the canteen. But, that was, I tried to sort of implement that way back then. And also, I sort of said fish oils and various things just to help people, be in the right place. Because if you're not eating the right food and you're just living on canteen food and pop and things, then you're not going to have the ability to focus on your therapy. You're doing hard therapy. So, yeah, I guess that but as you know, prisons are systems and it's quite difficult to make too much change.
Well, it is, and I remember I tried to get vitamin D into the unit that I worked in Whitemoor, and this was before COVID, because lots of the staff were aware from their doctors that they were in vitamin D deficit, and obviously you're spending all this time indoors. It was like you're going to work in the winter in dark and coming home in the dark. So then you think about the prisoners who never go outside at all. And I suppose on this podcast we've just recently had a conversation with someone on Dan White on circadian rhythms. We have tried to and we've covered food before, so there's something about a lack of joined up thinking, I think, at times, but the system does make it hard when they've got someone who has got the expertise like you to be able to make more use of that, to, I suppose, to bring benefits to mental health beyond the talking therapy. And it's a shame that it's not able to be a bit more creative at times.
I think they have their remit, don't they? And they think you have your remit and do not step outside it. This is your role. This is your job. It's very hard. And actually the job itself is very encompassing. So it is also hard sometimes to have the energy to step outside that with the battles.
And has being a forensic psychologist been what you expected it to be?
I don't really know, because I don't think I had any particular expectations. I didn't go into it because I saw the name or anything. I went into it because I literally wanted to work at Grendon. So actually working at Grendon was what I expected it to be. And I sort of worked my way up. So I started there as a volunteer, and then I became the psych assistant, and then I managed to get a job as a trainee on one of the wings, and then finally qualified. So it was more about Grendon, and it was more about doing what I saw other forensic psychologists and therapists do at Grendon, and being able to do that myself. I'd say in that respect, it was what I'd expect it to be. Now, having stepped out of Grendon and working at Gartree, I see a huge difference between forensic psychologists at Gartree and forensic psychologists at Grendon. They're very, very different in their focus and things. And I never realised that. I thought all forensic psychologists would be able to be. I think maybe I'm more aligned to how NHS forensic psychologists are. I don't know.
Could you explain the difference in terms of, for listeners who might not appreciate that there is a difference in the different environments? Because Grendon is quite a particular forensic environment, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I guess Grendon is all about therapy, really. And you're sort of, I don't know whether, because David was there, whether he would agree with this, but I would say you're sort of the therapy manager's right-hand person there, and you tend to, work with the therapy manager. So there's a lot more of a focus on therapy rather than assessing risk. You're obviously there to keep an eye on risk and help make sure the treatment targets address risk. But there is much more of a sort of, I suppose, a focus on the therapy rather than the risk. Whereas in Gartree, a lot of their psychologists, I think they're trying to change it now, because there's a lot more staff support at Gartree and a lot more trying to be more holistically thinking. But I think that predominantly forensic psychologists in mainstream prisons are there to assess risk and see how successful the programs have been, in reducing and of someone's risk. So that seems to me to be their, they do other jobs like training and things like that, but it is essentially risk focused, whereas I think Grendon was more treatment focused.
Yeah. And I would absolutely love to ask you what it's like being anti-establishment and working for the prison service, but I'm not going to, Sue, because I suspect that would be quite a challenging question to answer. Yes. So thank you.
But it is interesting what you're saying, because you're obviously implying, well, more than implying really, that the culture of the establishment that you're working in has a profound effect on the nature of the work and the style of the work that you do. And so you've touched a lot on Grendon, the culture at Grendon, but what would you say are the sort of most marked differences between a culture at a place like Grendon and a Cat B establishment like Gartree?
Well, it's interesting, really, because I think, Grendon is a great place, and it is a flagship of therapy. But, and the culture is everyone is in therapy and, everything is part of belonging and the whole. And although also Grendon, I think in that respect, suffers from being quite a big beast, like moving the Titanic. So if you want to get something changed at all in therapy, then that is quite difficult. But it's also prison officers, it's the accepted job of the prison is to provide therapy. If you go to Gartree, which is also actually isn't a bad prison, I think it's quite a good one for what it is. It's a life of prison. The accepted job there that everyone is keeping the public safe, reducing risk, and it isn't therapy. However, what I have found is that because I'm an extremely small unit, as long as I don't put my head above the parapet, I can actually get away with doing a lot more therapy because I can change things if they're not working and be much more responsive and much more. And I mean, I've only got 12 residents anyway, so and 16 staff. So you've got a small bubble. And as long as you toe the prison line and don't cause any great shakes, you can actually create a really, really therapeutic environment. Although that does get, interfered with if there's a, prison takes precedence. Definitely at Gartree, whereas at least at Grendon there's more room for negotiation. Don't know whether that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. But I also think, you said it's hard changing therapy at Grendon, though I think it actually has changed quite a lot over the last 15 years or so. I think there is a much greater presence of alternative therapies. Complementary therapies, we used to call them, now than they used to be.
No, I'm not. I think, I loved Grendon and I was really sad to leave it. And I, think it's a great place and it's a great vision. And I really, really miss it. I really miss it.
And the other side of it is that I think it can be enormously difficult to change the culture in a big establishment. As an example, any of the major prisons really, that it's really hard for a governor to go in and change a culture. Yeah,
I think at Gartree we at the moment we're very lucky. We've got an acting governor, Rachel, and she is incredibly supportive of the TCs and the units there. So we're, generally whatever she can allow us, she will. But I do think that you're right. If you're in a prison like that, you are at the, if another governor comes in and doesn't have quite the same mindset, then it can all go pear-shaped very quickly. I think that is something and governors do change quite quickly. And so I think that is a risk. So I think perhaps I'm it's a golden era with the governor we've got.
They often bring a whole entourage with them as well, don't they? So,
yes.
They all leave en masse and you get a whole new senior management team in one go. So culture can be quite drastically influenced.
I think that we've suffered a little bit. So we quite often have a change of functional head. So you train one functional head up to be really therapeutic or have therapeutic thinking, and then you get a new one that you have to retrain. Luckily the ones we've got have all been quite amenable, but then once they leave that our function, they then turn back to how they used to be. It's a bit,
Well, hopefully they picked up something, but by functional head you mean that's like a junior governor who manages a particular
Yes.
area
So
of activity.
yeah.
Great. Yeah. So you made this major shift from Grendon to Gartree to go and work in TC Plus there.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what that is?
Well, when I was doing my training, when I was a trainee, I was lucky enough to be on the TC Plus unit at Grendon. And I really enjoyed working with the people with learning disabilities. I thought it was a really genuine place to be, because for me, almost what you see is what you get, rather than, there was a lot less in the way of, I mean, there's a lot of obviously undercurrents with therapy and things that are going on, but there was a much more of it felt like much more of an ability to more honesty, because there was people with learning disabilities, although they can be disingenuous sometimes, find it much more difficult, I think, to be disingenuous because of the way their minds work. And I really enjoyed working with that population, really. And I also felt that an awful lot of them probably shouldn't have been in prison, and that there could have been earlier interventions. There was lots of things that really, it was a population that I really sort of felt, weren't considered, and their needs weren't being met. So it's just something that I really enjoyed working with. So when the opportunity, once I qualified, came up at Gartree to be the therapy manager, and I thought, so I didn't actually expect to get it. I went for it and got the job, which was a big learning curve, huge learning curve, because, although I'd supervised staff and managed staff, I'd never managed a whole team of officers and psychotherapists, and trying to keep everybody happy, and content and supported, is an enormous task. And in fact, what I then learned was that I'm not actually doing as much work with the residents as I thought I would be. It's mostly about staff and, nurturing the staff in order that they can do the work with the residents. So I got a little bit removed, which is a bit sad, but I still, managed to be involved in the community as much as I can be.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting description of how your work has developed. I mean, pretty similar to my experience.
Yeah.
Funnily enough. So in what ways is a TC Plus different from one of the mainstream TCs then? What do you do that's different?
I think it's contextualised for learning disability, so it's a lot slower. We have specialised staff, so we have a speech and language therapist, we have an OT, we have, and so the speech and language therapist will sort of work with each person to work out the best way to communicate with them. The groups are shorter with a break in the middle, so you have a break in the middle. And also we also have an element of structured psychoeducation in there, in order to, so what normally happens is people with learning disabilities can't necessarily access the normal offender behaviour programs, so we want to make sure we cover each area of risk as well in a psycho-ed way, and a slower sort of way that they can understand. So we have a structured group. So in that respect it's different. And also staff have to be trained, I guess. They have to understand about learning disability and how that impacts on the residents. So we have to have spend a lot of time with staff training, a lot of reflective practice, because quite often, learning disability presentations can be confused with people just being difficult, and so there's a lot of talking. Well, actually, is it because he hasn't actually understand? That he can only take it if you need to do 3-word chunks, and so there's a lot of repeating and a lot of time devoted to that sort of thing.
Yes, thank you.
I wondered, Sue, how much the learning disability element of presentation, how different that might be from a hospital population at all, and whether you've had any chance to observe that or interact with colleagues who might work within hospital settings.
Well, I'm very lucky and fortunate in that my psychologist Tamsin, she worked at Rampton. She's brilliant, so she's had quite a lot of experience in hospital LD situations. So she's the sort of font of all knowledge. But I have been to, they have a TC at Rampton, I don't think it's an accredited one, but they've started to set it up. So I've had the opportunity to go there. In terms of the only difference, I noticed was in that respect was that the people at Rampton had far more, I would say, mental illness in terms of their presentation. They were often, whereas our guys are usually relatively stable in that respect. But in terms of the actual learning disability side of things, I don't think there's too much difference, but it was more the stability.
Thank you.
So what do you think are the particular challenges for working with this particular group of people?
I think you have to be really, really tolerant. And sometimes, what might to you seem like a small gain is actually a huge gain. So, and you have to, I think, be very accepting and not have too many expectations. And I also, you do. You have to be patient and tolerant and be prepared to repeat and repeat and repeat and just give time and space. I think that what the really important thing is that all of our guys are highly traumatized, absolutely highly traumatized, and they always exist in their threat. So anything is a threat to them. And once they're in that system, they just can't take anything in. So the whole key to it, I believe, I might be wrong, is to actually try and make the environment as nurturing and soothing as possible and the relationships as safe as you can get them. And that just takes time, but it also takes a lot of input into the staff, because it's the staff that make those relationships. And so a lot of time is spent making sure the staff are not in their threat, which is quite hard when you're in a high secure prison and some of the staff are prison officers because they're already, so I think it is challenging working in that environment. And also, I guess the other challenging thing is that sometimes, a lot of people, the guys with learning disabilities, don't have the best in the way of social nuances, so they can be quite insulting. And so if you tend to take things personally, it wouldn't be the place to work. But I think it's a good environment. I enjoy it.
I always thought that hopelessness was the thing to try and militate.
No, you're right there. And I think the sad thing is, so, we put on family days twice a year and we get 1 or 2 families out of 12, and they don't have family support. They don't have anybody out there. And, that you've got these people in a nurturing, almost loving environment, really. And then and the worst thing is where do they go after that? Where do they go? Because there's no, we've had, I won't say the name, but David would remember him. We got him out to a hostel. It wasn't quite the ideal hostel, but because the environment was just not nurturing enough, he failed, wanted to come back, wanted to get back into prison, wanted to come back to Gartree. And that's always a danger if you make the place so, I suppose, belonging, and then you just throw people out with very little ability to negotiate the real world, then, so you're right, hopelessness, and that's difficult. We are a little bit luckier now because we've got high down learning disability pipe. So now we've got a space to move our guys onto. We've got close links with, and, but even so, they've then got to deal with the transition out into the community. So we're just passing the problem on, really. And the community, there are no resources out there. And least of all, does anyone want to give them to a prisoner as well, an ex-prisoner. So that's a bit difficult if you think about the whole thing of that. So you are right. Yeah, it does feel a bit hopeless sometimes.
And that feeling, I think, can engender expressions through, despair, depression in staff and in the client group, and often anger and rage as well, and a desire to take revenge upon someone who's making you feel so awful. Really, it seems to me you're describing a really challenging environment. What kind of support do you and colleagues get for the work?
Well, as you know, we do regular supervision with all the officers, and I supervise the psychotherapists and Tamsin and Daisy, so we do quite a lot of that. We do a lot of clinical reflection to try and work on the reasons for the behaviours, but we have sort of a couple of staff away days a year, which we try and do one team building one and one business one. We have actually managed to get one of the commissioners to pay for one of our officers to be trained in yoga. So we now offer yoga to the TC Plus staff and residents, actually. So we do joint sessions and non-joint sessions. And so I guess it is hard. I think the support comes from the team and within the team and talking. We do have sensitivity, which is where we have a space to talk through team dynamics, which is now is facilitated. So it's being a lot better used. We did have some terrible problems with sensitivity because it's very hard sometimes to talk about how you feel about team members in a team. But slowly we've got over that. The TC World invites us to TC development events. We try and do a lot of in-house training to support, and we also try and do online training. So we're very much focused on giving people, I think, trying to slow everything down rather than rush and give people space to be able to think and feel. I don't know whether the support's ideal, but we do try.
And what about yourself? You've mentioned yoga already. How do you get support?
Well, I actually am quite lucky. I belong to a reflective practice group provided by the OPD, and so I do that once a month. I also get clinical supervision from a forensic psychologist from Rampton, which is great. So I get supervision, I get support. My NHS line manager is very supportive, so if I need any support from him, I can get support. So I generally think I can reach out and get support. I have a lot of really good colleagues. There's Jessica, who's the head of the GTC. So we have a good relationship. The two, I don't know whether it's the same when you were there, David, but there's competition between the two a little bit. So there's a little, because the staff group share the same shift patterns or they work, and then there's a little bit of who's the best TC type thing. So there can be a little bit of splitting and various things going on there. But generally I'm supported. And the prison, as I said, I'm lucky in the governor at the moment, and the senior management team are supportive as well. So right now I feel supported.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Sue. That's really interesting.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that conversation.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for letting me talk about it. I am quite passionate about it. I love the TC Plus at Gartree. And anytime you want to visit, you're more than welcome.
Well, I mean, just to, for me, encapsulate what I think you've been describing, because you obviously liked being at Grendon and the kind of culture and atmosphere there, but you said it was sometimes very hard to get things to change, whereas what you probably find in the TC Plus is there's much more scope to be inventive, to be creative, to do different things.
Yes, there is. I mean, if you wanted to get an officer trained in yoga at Grendon, then probably you could, but there would be an uproar because not every officer would be allowed to be trained, if you see what. So that's the sort of thing you were up against there. Whereas, at Gartree, I don't think anybody knows apart from me that he's been trained in yoga. So and the team.
Great. Right, that's it. I'm going to stop.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.